here in Europe, of course. And there have been so many reports over the last few days with respect of these elections and possible outcomes, probable outcomes, all different sorts of alliances and new coalitions, perhaps. We hear that the far-right factions could unite with consequences for several aspects of EU policy, ranging from the green energy transition to agriculture and the politically sensitive subject, of course, migration. Protection of democracy and rule of law have always been very, very high on the EU agenda. And today there's concern that the agenda may be influenced by illiberal forces within Europe, which may push the bloc more in the direction of an amalgamation of nation states rather than a closer union. And EU enlargement is once more on the table with 9 candidate countries. And at the same time, the normative values which Europe stands for are being tested. So too is the strength of its soft power, its global influence in a fragmenting world, and its relationships with Africa, Latin America, the United States, China, and others. The next holders of the EU high office in different portfolios will have their hands full. A full agenda with multiple challenges around several issues, including the EU economy and the matter of its competitiveness or lack thereof, NATO and the issue of Europe's defense, and the nature of EU relationships, including with its friends. To talk with me and you, and those of you joining us, I should have said hello to you. Thank you for being with us. To continue the conversation with us is Sir Michael Leigh, whom I consider also a friend and a colleague. First of all, a friend. I mean, that's how relations are built. Relationships. So Michael is a former cabinet member for several EU commissioners and a former DG for enlargement at the EU Commission. He is the academic director for Johns Hopkins University campus in Bologna, where he's a professor who practices and teaches EU policy and global risk. Michael, welcome. We are delighted to have you here with us this afternoon, and you brought the sun to Brussels. Let's get started with the obvious. The long-awaited elections, EU elections, commence today. And indeed, this is a year of very important elections around the world. Mexico has just voted in its first female president. And in Latin America, I would say this is a very important thing. Well, in the world, it's important, not just Latin America. Voters in South Africa have just dealt the party of Mandela a punishing blow after 30 years. President Modi's win in India, it was a win, but smaller than expected, not as impactful as expected. Elections around the United Kingdom are around the corner, and Brexiters may be out. And meanwhile, the world waits for perhaps the results of the biggest elections in November in the United States. And so much depends on what happens next with those particular elections. Of importance not just for the EU, but worldwide, ranging from global trade and tariffs. As you know, President Biden has increased by 100% tariffs on EVs, electrical vehicles from China, doubled the tariffs on solar panels and batteries. President Trump has says, well, he's gone up by 100%. I'll go up by at least 200%. And what is more, I'll put tariffs on mostly everything coming into the United States from everybody. So there's that to look forward to, maybe, maybe not. The issue of funding for Ukraine's continued crisis is also something on the agenda to take a look at. The strength of the NATO alliance, what might happen to that, the climate change agenda, and so much more. including perhaps fundamentally the status of America as a dependable ally for its allies. And here in Europe, from France to Italy to the Netherlands, join in others in the EU, like Hungary, there seems to be quite a shift politically to the hard right. Democracy and its principles and institutions are being questioned, not only externally, of course, but fundamentally from inside. And voter confidence in governments and their institutions seem to be at an all-time low. So, Michael, to you, is this a fair assessment? What accounts for this in your view? And what are the likely outcomes in these elections? And what might the implications be?
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Is the microphone working okay? Yeah. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a great pleasure being here with you personally to exchange views and with everyone who's joined us this afternoon, both here and online. I have to admit, my most immediate challenge as far as the elections are concerned, as a new Belgian, Brexit oblige, the first time I'll be voting in an election in Belgium as a Belgian citizen, is to work out whom to vote for in the federal elections, the regional elections, and the European elections. But luckily, I've got some extremely good compatriots, fellow Belgians, who've given me a tutorial on the elections. So I think I'm reasonably prepared at this point. These elections are taking place after a period of extraordinary activism on the part of the European Union. And having been associated in one role or another with the EU for many, many years, I would say that the last 5 years have been the most activist period for the European Commission and the EU more generally since the days of Jacques Delors, in the period of the 1980s and 1990s, when the single market was founded, the single currency, the foundations for the first big enlargement. When you go back to the multiple crises of the last few years and the way the EU has responded, I think we've seen an extraordinary period of activism and a very ambitious agenda, European Green Deal, digital regulation, a whole range of issues. I do not recall an equally activist Commission. And I think, in a sense, the main issue at stake in these elections, apart from the underlying fundamental issues you mentioned about values, about democracy, about rule of law, where we may be headed in that respect, is whether what we've seen in the last few weeks, which is basically the mainstream parties reaching out, or some of them anyway, to the extremes, trying to neutralize their influence, whether this heralds a kind of electoral pause or hiatus. And after the elections, the EU will in some way get back on track, whatever the outcome. And the big issues that have been out there the last few years, starting with the European Green Deal, but also addressing economic problems and a whole range of challenges after the polycrises of recent years. So has this been a kind of electoral pause over the last few weeks, or is it a change of direction? And I don't think we'll know the answer until we see the results on Sunday and early next week. And I think it's possible that the commitments that have been made are so strong and so clear that whatever the outcome, the investments that have been made by business, the commitment of civil society groups, the public, political parties to this very ambitious agenda is so strong that we'll get back on track. But it's also possible that we'll see what we've seen before. And after those 10 years of Jacques Delors' presidency, in some sense, the member states felt they'd had enough of EU activism, and they appointed a president of the Commission in Jacques Santer, whom they expected to be less activist. His commission ended in unfortunate circumstances. Will we see a repeat of that? Or will we see the EU getting back on track and pursuing this very ambitious agenda? And for the rest of the world, this makes a big difference too. Will we see an ambitious European Union, a European Union seeking to project outwardly its principles, its values, its key policies, exercising soft power, as you said, in the way that the EU has always done traditionally? Or will we see an EU that is pulling back, that is more modest, that is really seeking to consolidate and implement rather than to develop in new and ambitious directions for the future?
I'm sorry, I got so comfortable listening to you, I forgot that I needed to say something in return.
No problem.
No, this is, it's a lot to think about, but when you also consider the fact that between these elections, which has started today, and the last cycle of elections, the EU has faced a lot of crises and a lot of challenges, ranging from a global pandemic to a fiscal crisis, an economic crisis, and wars,
Migration.
changing supplies of energy, inflation at the all-time low, and still, of course, the specter of years of no growth economically and rather stagnation, a flat line. How has the EU coped, before we think of what's coming forward, how has the EU coped from a policy sense, do you think, with all of those crises?
I think some of the problems that you've mentioned are so fundamental that they're beyond the scope of an organization whose budget is really limited to 1% of GDP, except for exceptional circumstances as after COVID, and where the main responsibility for fiscal policy anyway remains with the member states. So addressing issues like sluggish growth, injecting more dynamism into our economies, still remains very largely the responsibility of member states rather than the EU as such. But coping with some of the crises that you've mentioned has fallen into the lap of the European Union over the past years. And while there was initially some hesitation, the global financial crisis, 2008, the successive euro crises, you've listed the crises that we faced, obviously the pandemic, and so on. When you look back on this period, I think we can be fairly proud of the way the EU has responded. It's always possible to criticize. There are always aspects that can be called into question. But, you know, who would ever have thought that in a European Union where public health is mainly the responsibility of the member states, that the EU as such would take a lead in the procurement of personal protective equipment, of vaccines, and, you know, despite carping, basically it worked extremely well. The Next Generation EU initiative, even if it wasn't a Hamiltonian moment which heralded real euro bonds for the future, nonetheless, it was an extremely bold move, which now is being implemented in the country where I spend much of my time, in Italy. Questions are raised about how it's being implemented, but nonetheless, I think it made a crucial difference in Europe getting back on its feet after this crisis. And similarly, who would have thought after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that the European Union, whose founding treaties, in fact, exclude the possibility of using EU funds for the procurement of weapons, you know, would have devised a facility, albeit called by the Orwellian name of European Peace Facility, which could reimburse the member states for the purchase of lethal weapons. Again, there are limitations, there are problems, there are aspects that one can criticize. There's a need for unanimity. There are those who are opposed to the unanimity. We can come to these issues in more detail. But I think when you pass in review the EU's response to the multiple crises of recent years, the overall balance is positive.
Not so long ago, Michael, if we just roll back just a few years ago, there was a sense that the EU integration project was under threat in many, many ways. growth was even much more sluggish at the time than it is today. And we had the matter of Brexit. And there was a fear, given the very difficult situation, particularly for the southern countries within the EU. There was even talk of perhaps Greeks following that route. And there were several discussions along that that particular path. Well, that has not come to pass, and in fact, as you've quite rightly pointed out, the EU has managed these storms relatively well. This is not a conversation today about what's happening in the UK, and we can get there as well. But Brexit seems to have dealt a bigger blow, of course, to the UK, especially given the fact that the single market was the largest market. But anyway, moving along, it would seem that we've gotten over this these particular range of issues, and now enlargement is very much on the boards again. As we said, there are 9 member countries. There are others also queuing up who very much would like to consider that one day they might, in fact, be candidates as well. We know that Turkey has been in the mix for a very long time. Is it almost 18 years?
2005, the negotiations began. 1999, they were accepted as a candidate.
Right, and that status still remains. Now there seems to be a shift in the narrative towards enlargement, and the mood, in some quarters at least, seems to be favoring, yes, increase right now, and there seems to be a response to particular geopolitical tensions and reasons. What's your assessment of this new move? And
well, of course, when you raise the question of enlargement, you touch on an issue close to my heart, as I was involved in the enlargement process for many, many years, and finally as Director General for Enlargement. I discuss this matter and analyze it a great deal with my students and think about it a great deal. And as with many issues, I've chosen in recent times to think of it in terms of scenarios. I mean, the sort of main scenario that is being delineated now by the institutions, the EU, many, many observers, is that the EU is on track towards perhaps having as many as 35 members by the mid-2030s, assuming the accession of countries in Eastern Europe, of Ukraine, of Moldova, perhaps of Georgia even at the end of the next decade or at some point in the medium term. This scenario also assumes that the hopes that have been raised in countries that did not previously have the famous accession perspective has given a new boost to the enlargement prospects for countries in the Western Balkans who've been waiting for more than 20 years, and that basically enlargement is back. This is one scenario. The other scenario is a much more cautious one. And in this scenario, enlargement is viewed to a considerable extent mainly as a geopolitical instrument. And the perspective of joining the European Union has been given to these countries. It's been given in exceptional circumstances in which war returned to Europe. The perspective given to Ukraine and then by extension to Moldova and Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina was meant first and foremost as a message of solidarity to Ukraine in wartime, and a clear message to Mr. Putin that the EU in no way accepted that Ukraine was in some sense part of a Russian sphere of influence. And according to the second scenario, the enlargement perspective has been reopened for largely geopolitical reasons, but as in fact President Macron and others have said, it may take decades rather than years, and there remain very serious obstacles to be overcome on both sides. And an extreme version of the second scenario would be that 10 years hence, the membership of the EU will still look very much the way it looks today, and that far more time will be needed to overcome these obstacles, whether to the east or to the southeast. Which one of these scenarios, or which third or fourth scenario might come about in practice, remains to be seen. But I don't think it's obvious that the scenario which is put forward in most official statements and commentaries can be taken for granted.
And this is just a little bit of an aside. There had been quite a lot of conversations within the EU around the time of the second financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and then there was a mini crisis, 2014 and 2015, about the speed at which southern member states had been included in the EU integration project, because structurally the economies are quite so different. And there's a divide with respect of history. And from time to time, we see those questions coming up again and again. Has the EU learned anything from that previous experience that informs the approach to enlargement today?
Well, there I'm tempted, of course, to put on my old official hat and give you an official answer, but I won't do that. But I can say in all honesty and sincerity, I don't think that what we always used to call the fifth enlargement, which culminated with the accession of Bulgaria and Romania and subsequently Croatia in 2013, I don't think this was in any sense a mistake. And although we have reason to be concerned about political developments, economic developments, in some cases fundamental human rights and even the rule of law in some of the new member states, I think before raising those criticisms, we should look to ourselves. And these problems are by no means the monopoly of the not-so-new member states. And we're facing many challenges, including perhaps challenges even to democracy as we know it in some of our older member states as well. The elections in the Netherlands, I think, came as a big surprise to quite a few observers. So I don't think this was in any sense a mistake. And if we try and imagine an alternative past in which, let us say, for argument's sake, Bulgaria and Romania had not been admitted, I think they would be far less prosperous than they are today and far less stable than they are today, whatever problems one can identify. And I think the kind of difficulties which we see in countries further east would also have applied to Bulgaria and Romania and indeed to some of the other new member states. So I think that when we look back over the period since 2004, 2007, 2013, whether in terms of economic development or overall stability or the consolidation of fundamental rights, the rule of law, and so on, that the experiment has been basically a success. On the other hand, lessons have been drawn. And I think one of the main lessons is that the European Union has tremendous leverage over the political and economic and juridical and administrative development of potential members up to the moment when they sign an accession treaty with the European Union. And that after that, the leverage diminishes considerably. And therefore, the EU, in subsequent negotiations, has put up front fundamental issues which used to be left until the very end. The issues concerning the legal system, fundamental rights and freedoms, the rule of law, and so on. So these issues now need to be addressed first as a cluster of questions before we can go on to negotiate more detailed technical matters. And I think if we ever get to the point, as I hope we will, of getting into substantive negotiations with the new group of candidates, that we will draw on this experience too, to be sure that we only go as quickly as they are ready to go in proving their commitment to these fundamental rights and principles.
Yeah. I mean, even now as we speak, even within the EU, from time to time, it's hard to derive consensus around certain issues. We will come to a conversation a little bit later on the matter of the relationship around China, for example. But there are other issues as well. You mentioned rule of law, even, and a growing sense of illiberalism in certain member states. How is that being dealt with?
I think until now, the European Union, and for that matter the United States, and democracies around the world, on balance, have proved their resilience to this point. And the idea that there is a sort of unstoppable drift towards the illiberal left or the illiberal right, I think there's nothing inevitable about this. And we've seen resilience in Poland. We've seen resilience in Spain. The country that I used to know best, the United Kingdom, in all probability, will see a change of government and the population deciding to expel from office a government of which they become weary, to put it mildly, and giving an opportunity to the opposition. So the idea that sort of democratic alternance in power no longer applies, and that illiberalism has somehow taken over, and that democracy as such is under threat in Europe, I don't think that we've reached that point, and I hope we never will.
It's interesting as you made these particular points. I was thinking, it's a major irony in the United States, one of the world's mature democracies as well, that we have a candidate who could very well be president again in November, who is a convicted felon. But at the same time, on the other side, we have the son of a sitting president in court on various charges. On the one hand, there are those who say that, well, the system, the judiciary in the United States has been hijacked for very polarizing political reasons. But on the other hand, there are those who also say it shows that democracy is working and that no one is above the law.
No, I agree with you there. I mean, I think one of the main difficulties that we've all confronted, the United States as well, when you look at the Democratic Party, and sort of centre-left parties in Europe, they have all been under severe pressure, I would say, over the last 2 decades or so. And when we decry the rise of the hard right, I think we also have to consider what gaps have opened up and how and why they've opened up, which the hard right has been quick to fill. And I think, without exaggeration, what one can refer to as the collapse of the centre-left in quite a few European countries, and to a certain degree in the United States itself. I think there are a number of reasons for this. I think, there was the famous statement of Frank Fukuyama about the end of history, which was obviously an exaggeration. But the fact that the left just about everywhere, bought into what some would call the neoliberal agenda, and therefore lost a major way of distinguishing itself from the right. In some countries, like one of the countries I know well today, Italy, where I spend a lot of my time, where the collapse of the centre-left was also very much related to corruption. It's not as if the left is completely immune to problems of corruption. And particularly the fact that the centre-left lost touch with its traditional base in the working class, the labour unions, and so on, and got distracted into a different kind of agenda, which sort of working people thought was an agenda more adapted to urban elites, middle-class elites, have meant that the centre-left in many, many countries have lost the support of its traditional constituency. And the rise of the right, particularly astute politicians on the far right, and who saw the opportunity and who saw the gap and who saw the possibility of attracting, particularly, I mean, working class is an expression that's no longer very much à la mode, but of course there are working people everywhere, even if they're not bashing metal to the same extent, nonetheless. And centre-left parties became to some extent detached from their natural constituency, which the right were very happy to take advantage of. And I think we've seen this phenomenon in many countries, and particularly astute politicians who've seen the main chance. You mentioned Turkey earlier on in the enlargement context, and we shouldn't forget that Turkey is still technically anyway a candidate for EU membership. Exactly the same phenomenon has taken place there, where the main opposition party, the CHP, a kind of social democratic party, the descendant of Ataturk's party, also lost touch with its base. And Erdogan was only too ready to fill that space and to provide the kind of benefits, public goods, private goods, that could win votes. And we've seen that's continued, although in the municipal elections in Turkey, there's been pushback and signs of resilience in Turkey too. So the kind of phenomena we're talking about in the United States, in Europe, and in Turkey show that these trends are much broader than only in the European Union itself.
Yeah, interesting. Now, of course, one of the other, I would say, challenges in the near term for Europe is one around the issue of demography. Europe is the world's fastest aging continent. Fertility has really plummeted. Older people are living longer and better lives. Fewer people are coming into the workplace. A number of governments, including Hungary, for example, had tried to incentivize younger people to have larger families, more babies, and various other incentives, including starting college funds for kids who were born past a certain year and all of those sort of things. But none of these things have moved the needle in any way. So this brings us to a particular conundrum. Who is going to work to pay the taxes on which the European way of life is based? I mean, there is this unfortunate remark made by foreign policy chief of Europe, Borrell, who made this unfortunate, I keep on calling it unfortunate for want of a better word, about the European garden and all these animals trying to get in. So, are the animals going to be let in? I mean, this is a bad way of putting it. Let me rephrase it, Michael, please. I need to be more polite. The reality is, right, more retirees are entering the ranks of being over 65. People are living longer. The natural increase in population is not allowing for a rejuvenation of a working force that is required. And at the same time, migration is a very difficult political issue, and that's the reality. How do we square those particular issues in a way that, from a policy and strategic point of view, allows Europe to continue maintaining the lifestyle, the benefits, the prosperity that it has worked so hard to achieve over time?
Well, this really rings a bell with me. I mean, the country where I spend most of my time now in Italy has, I think, the lowest birth rate after Japan and South Korea in the world, and a very rapidly aging population. Just a little story. I mean, honestly, in Bologna, where I live, it's quite astonishing sometimes. You're walking down the street. It's a country where, you know, gender issues are being tackled very well and where men are increasingly accepting their responsibilities. And you see someone approaching you, a man, clutching in his arms what looks to be a baby, and it turns out to be a dog. And I mean, really, it's no exaggeration. I think people are buying pets, you know, instead of having babies, in Bologna anyway, to a very considerable extent. And, you can say, is this a sign of decadence, a society that no longer has the will to reproduce itself? I mean, we can have all of those kinds of discussions. But regardless of all of that, the fact is, as you say, that there are major economic, financial challenges for the future linked to an aging population and a very low birth rate. And one of my deep concerns is that the questions of demography on the one side and migration on the other are being dealt with as entirely separate issues on the whole. If you just look at the European Commission, we have one commissioner who has rather quaintly named a portfolio of democracy and demography. The democracy part referred mainly to the conference on the late lamented, I was going to say, conference on the future of Europe. And another commissioner who is responsible for migration, but whose portfolio is mainly home affairs, basically interior affairs, judicial and police cooperation, and so on. So migration is being handled to a very considerable extent as a security issue, and is being perceived in that light and treated in that light, not only by the EU, but within governments and by the United States. And demography is a sort of interesting and important development, but it is seen in the context of labor policy, social policy, family policy, and so on, but not being linked with the question of migration. Now, we all know that migration is only a short to medium way of tackling the demographic issue, because immigrant populations quite quickly begin to follow the demographic pattern of the country to which they have migrated. But in the short term, and the short term means a generation, 30 years, it certainly is a way of tackling the problem. And it would be my wish, if anyone is listening, that in the future, after the European Parliament elections, and after a president of the Commission has been named and approved by the European Parliament, and she or he decides on their portfolios, I think there should be a single portfolio on demography and migration. And I think this would be a very small step to linking these two issues and not treating migration as mainly a security problem. In all fairness, I must say that Giorgia Meloni is very perceptive on some matters, and she does see that this is a major challenge for Italy. So on the one side, as the leader of a hard-right party who has come to power partly because of people's preoccupation about immigration, she needs to talk tough and preferably take measures to assure the control of the country's external borders and to prevent these tragedies in the Mediterranean. But at the same time, she has taken a positive policy and has greatly increased the number of visas, particularly for qualified migrant workers coming into the country. And I think this approach is one that needs to be followed more generally. And we need to, I would like to see the new Commission, in drawing up its program, coming up with an overall analysis of the challenges facing the EU in the fields of demography and including the question of migration, and to see these two issues not treated as though never the twain shall meet, but as interrelated. And I'd like to see that happening at government level as well.
Hopefully someone is listening. Let's shift gears a little bit, Michael, if we can, and take a look at the EU in the wider context of the world. We've dealt with some of the internal challenges, and maybe there are opportunities at the end that we can come to as well. But let's start with the issue of the EU as a normative power. This is a period of great power competition among various crises, including war in Europe and in the Middle East. And there's a sense that at this particular time, Europe standing in the world and the power of its example, its values and its soft power are all being tested. Some of Europe's partners, particularly from Africa and the global south, raise serious concerns about double standards, hypocrisy, for example, in the EU's application of sanctions on Venezuela. The EU, as you will recall, and the United States slapped sanctions on Venezuela as a result of several issues dealing with elections, human rights, and so on. But those seem to have been slowly, surely been lifted as soon as the EU needed to transfer supplies of gas and energy and oil from Russian sources. And there is this view in the global south that sanctions are weapons that are used in self-interest by the North or the Western countries to be turned on and off at whim. And there is widespread concern with respect of this. And certainly the issue of war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, versus the crisis that we now see precipitated by Hamas's atrocities of October 7th, or there are those that said that there were dates that preceded this. But what we see in Gaza has raised condemnation and concern around the world. Europe has been largely silent, though in the past several weeks a number of countries have come forward recognizing the state of Palestine, given the need to create some pathway to stability and peace in this part of the world. Spain, in fact, yesterday made a number of statements, as have Ireland and one or two other European countries. The rest are notably silent. And there's little consensus within the EU on some of these issues, and the perception of the EU's soft power in holding aspects of international law, consistently, that is. So the question to you would be, to what extent is Europe being guided by its own values? And is Europe honoring its own values at home and abroad? And what's at stake here?
How much time do we have?
For this particular question, we'll have about 3 minutes.
Okay, well, we could be here till midnight, I think. The very important issues you raised, and very complex ones too. You began speaking about the EU's soft power as the main way in which the EU exercises influence in the world. I do think that soft power, I nail my colors to the mast, okay? I do think that the main way in which the EU exercises influence beyond its own borders is through what Joe Nye years ago called soft power. And soft power is mainly about emulation. It's mainly about having a model, whether a model of society, a political model, a social model, an economic model, which others find attractive. And whether those in the immediate vicinity who actually hope one day to become members, or those further afield who treat it as a kind of example. And I think as far as that is concerned, the fundamental situation remains largely unchanged. And even though perhaps in soft power terms, the United States still perhaps is the champion of soft power, whether from Hollywood to all the other aspects of the American way of life that people around the world seek to emulate or find entertaining or amusing. But Europe too, I think, puts forward a model of society that people still find attractive, as we can see by the number of countries still seeking to join the European Union. And in fact, I think the soft power approach is so appealing that powers like Russia and China, which do not have the same fundamental values and principles as the European Union, that can't lay claim to a democracy and the rule of law. At least we have principles that we may betray from time to time. But I think the other leading actors don't even pretend to be committed to those particular values. But nonetheless, they have understood that soft power is necessary in order to win hearts and minds around the world. I learned recently from a friend who just returned from a conference in Petersburg that there are now 27,000 Africans taking online courses in the Russian language, and that Russia has decided to send 1,000 university professors to Africa in various faculties to teach in different schools. The Chinese really used to have no time at all for soft power. It was just the bottom line, big investment project, very often a white elephant, no generation of employment for local workers, no transfer of technology, and so on. They've understood that this is not the way to win people over, and they too, whether few Confucius centers, building the biggest Confucius center in the world in Serbia, on the site of the former embassy that was bombed by NATO during the dreadful wars in the former Yugoslavia. So the notion that soft power is a very important approach to influencing others. The EU has no monopoly on this, and the EU is not always consistent. And we, like others around the world, are not always in every respect true to our own values. Nonetheless, I think in broad terms, the kind of society that exists and the living standards that exist, despite all the weaknesses in Europe, are ones to which people around the world probably aspire in different ways. So I think this kind of soft power approach is the right approach, and I am actually a skeptic as to whether the EU itself can move beyond the soft power approach into hard power and become a real actor in the defense field in the way that is very often discussed.
Well, I was just about to come into a particular issue, moving away from soft power. Well, not exactly moving entirely away from it. But the truth is that the EU has never demonstrated a political will to actually be a global political actor in the way, for example, that the United States is. But then again, the United States is a superpower. And the EU has, in fact, despite the fact that it is an economic superpower, it has never displayed the sort of power on the global stage commensurate with its economic weight, and seems not to have had the political will over time to be able to do that. But over the past several years, that economic weight, which has given quite a lot of leverage to the EU in negotiating trade agreements and negotiating other sorts of partnership agreements with countries of the global south, for example, has been really the strength of its economic, not growth, but that single market of 500 million plus people is a prosperous market. Of course, there are concerns today with respect of the EU New Green Deal and all of the different policies associated with it, including CBAM, the cross-border mechanism, adjustment mechanism that is considered to be protectionist not only by poorer countries, but even countries like Australia, for example. And there is conversation about taking some of these particular policies to the WTO. However, having said this, the fact of the matter is that the EU share of global output is declining. In the 1990s, it was about 25% of global output. By 2040, it will be 11% of global output. And at that rate, it will not even be half the output of China. Where does that leave the leverage that the EU has been able to demonstrate over time in the process of securing its own interest and in the process of pursuing its own normative values, better environmental and labor standards and all of those sort of things.
Well, we have to be here till midnight tomorrow, I think, to address these issues. If we have around 3 minutes, I'll do my best. I think that relative decline is not a matter that should concern us. I mean, the fact that birth rates have been much higher in certain other parts of the world that there has been until now, even though it's peaking in China and India and elsewhere, a very rapid increase in population and also very rapid economic growth. I mean, China over the last 2 decades has probably taken 500 million people out of poverty. And there's tremendous increase in their purchasing power and similar phenomena elsewhere, whether in Southeast Asia, even in India to a very considerable extent as well. I don't think there's anything that should concern us about statistics that show that Europe has a smaller share of global GDP, a smaller share of global trade, etc. I think that these are interesting figures, but what should concern us is the absolute level of economic performance in Europe, not so much its relative level. And there, I think we come back to the beginning of our discussion this afternoon, in which you referred to relative stagnation. I mean, we've seen a period of rapid economic growth in the new member states, which is very impressive and which vindicates, I think, enlargement in the past. I would think that, of course. But our concern should be whether we can get back onto a path of green and digitally sophisticated growth in the future, or whether we are condemned to zero or close to zero growth rates. I mean, in Italy, there has basically been no economic growth for 30 years, and there's been little increase in productivity for 30 years, and there's been a huge emigration of young people from Italy. First of all, can they get jobs? And secondly, if they get jobs, are they secure jobs, the fear of precariousness, and so on? And they're seeking employment elsewhere. So it is the fundamental performance of our economies and the risk that the absolute level of our economies might decline rather than relative decline that should concern us. We still have the internal market as a fantastic source of leverage. We've received the report of Enrico Letta, one Italian prime minister who's been looking at how the EU can better leverage the internal market in the future. And Mario Draghi will deliver his report also on competitiveness from another angle after the elections to the European Parliament. And in fact, the speeches of President Macron too have referred extensively to this issue. So if it wishes, the new Commission, the new leaders of Europe after the election could shift away from what I think has turned out to be the chimera, the illusion of being geopolitical actors to becoming more geoeconomic actors. And I think that these 2 former Italian prime ministers, the French president and others, have potentially given the EU a positive agenda for the next 5 years to try and rectify some of the imbalances that you referred to.
That's interesting. Thanks for that, Michael. A couple of quick things, though, which involves the United States. The United States and Europe are allies. The transatlantic relationship has been in place since the Second World War, and is at the very heart of the Western-led liberal world order. That relationship has not always just been an easy one. It has been, in fact, gone through a bit of turbulence, also depending on the president at home in the White House, right? Under President Trump, the relationship was a lot more turbulent than it was over, since President Biden has been in office. And the interesting thing with President Biden, though, is that the tone has changed. but some of the policies haven't changed that create a little bit of tension in the alliance. And certainly there was a sense when the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan in a way that left the Allies a little bit on the back foot, to put it mildly. And then within 14 days after that, the announcement was made by the UK standing with the United States and Australia on the matter of AUKUS. The day before, the Europeans had just unveiled their Indo-Pacific strategy, their new one, not even knowing that AUKUS was on the books. There was a sense, I remember writing a piece that was published on the end of hubris, thinking, well, I mean, where does one go from there? But on the heels of all of that came the war in Ukraine. And I think that the consolidation of the allies around NATO was really forceful, and perhaps could have been a miscalculation from Russia's point of view as well. So this is a relationship that goes through different cycles. But there are, at this point in time, also discernible fault lines and tensions. One is definitely around the relationship with China. The United States, for the United States, China is a threat for many reasons that have been discussed. But also China is a rising China, which is a threat to United States hegemony. The EU does not see China in quite the same way. Yes, as a threat to be confronted from time to time, but also a collaborator, also a partner, and also a market of tremendous importance, as we see from both Germany and France, for example. And that creates its own pot of tensions with the United States. But the EU as a bloc today is also talking and mindful of the need to safeguard its industrial and manufacturing capacity, not only from Beijing, but from Washington as well, given the enormous subsidies that have been deployed by the Biden administration, the IRAs, with billions, for example. It's luring European firms to make huge investments in the United States and not in Europe. What does all of this mean for the EU? How can the EU be smart in its own self, in deploying its own subsidies? For example, why not partnerships with near neighbors in the continent that's so close by, in Africa? Would that not be a win? Friendshore in Africa. And then, you secure your manufacturing from competition from both the United States and China, but it's a win-win too in a partnership that you say is so important across the strait.
Once again, many, many interesting and important questions there. Let me just respond to some of them. We could come back perhaps to others a little bit later. I mean, I think that for the European Union, in a way, as I said at the beginning, the main challenge after the elections will be to see whether the flagship policies that we've developed, particularly European Green Deal, digital advancement, can be pursued or not in the future. And the relationship with China is critical to that. And there have been very large subsidies, as you say, the IRA in the United States, but also China. And China has developed a tremendous manufacturing capability in some of the fields that are crucial to our own efforts to achieve our own targets that we've set, whether for reducing emissions by 2030, by 2050, climate neutral, and so on. And basically, the dilemma that we face is whether we should accept that we will import not only solar panels, but electric vehicles from China and other means for generating energy in a renewable way, wind farms and all the rest of it from China at a low cost, which will help us to achieve our own objectives more quickly than we could do otherwise, or whether we should be mainly concerned that by doing this we may satisfy some of our environmental and climate goals, but we will kill off our own industry quickly in the process. The United States has chosen to respond by imposing huge tariffs, which Biden has for electric vehicles, 100%. Trump, of course, is one-upping this and saying, I will impose 200% tariffs. What should we do in Europe? And our approach, as always, is relatively cautious because we haven't really worked out what is the balance between these different objectives, and our member states are divided. There are and including our largest member state, which continues to depend on the Chinese market for a large part of its exports. Volkswagen sells 40% of its vehicles within China. We've seen several visits to Beijing by Scholz with business delegations, just at the very time when China is offering unqualified support to its friend and ally Russia at war in Ukraine and so on, because of a somewhat sort of mercantilist approach to relations with China, but which would be hotly opposed to the imposition of tariffs on imports from China of the level that the United States has in mind. And I think, again, for the new Commission, I'm putting all these issues onto the, in a way it keeps me young, the idea that we're having new leaders coming in, and now finally they're going to address these issues, demography, migration, these key questions vis-à-vis China. But you have to hope. If you don't hope, then there's no reason to vote and there's no reason to act in any way. But I do think that they have to have a coherent policy on this and have to strike the right balance between defending our own industry. You mentioned CBAM, for example. If we are making these huge efforts and imposing these huge costs on our own industry and our own population indirectly through taxation, so that we can have a cleaner environment and limit emissions, keep climate change down, and then import goods from countries that don't follow such standards, we will not achieve our own goals. And the world will not achieve its own goals. Of course, this may be perceived as a protectionist by some, but I think it's very logical, and you can't expect our own citizens and industries to make those sacrifices otherwise. So this is an extremely complex area in which I think we have to balance out different sets of objectives, and knowing Europe, probably we will come to eventual outcomes which are somewhere in between these very forceful measures taken by the United States and our own disinclination to do anything that could put into question the very important market in China for the exports from some of our key member states.
Okay, now Michael, I will ask perhaps just one more question, then we'll keep it short and then have an interactive session with all of our friends here. And it's on Russia and the relationship with Europe. Many years ago, I was a director for a foundation established by the Rockefeller Foundation. My headquarters was in a very cool and nice place. It was Broadway and very close to the West Village. Very nice part of Manhattan to be in. And I was young. It was glorious days. But the point of this is that as a result of that particular body of work, I did work around the world, including in Moscow and St. Petersburg for a while, around the time when the Soviet Union was in fact imploding. So I'm talking just a little after the 90s. What was enormously astounding for me was the sheer beauty of the culture and the heritage of the Russian people. St. Petersburg for me is one of the world's most beautiful cities. And going into the Hermitage, I was astounded at the portrayal of the very European as well as other influences, essence of the Russian people. married to kings and princes and princesses who are of European origin. It's a very, very close relationship. Clearly this has changed. What is your sense about the day after the war in terms of the relationship that has existed over the millennium between the people of Russia and the people of Europe?
Well, I think at the level of Russian culture, language, and civilization, and as you just put it, at the level of the people of Russia and the people of Europe, the current conflict and the war in Ukraine in no way puts into question our admiration and respect for Russian culture, civilization, and language, or the friendship between our peoples. I think this is something which has nothing directly to do with the current conflict, even though you may say that with approval levels for Putin of 70% plus in polls, which are fairly objective within Russia, you could say, well, I mean, maybe it is the Russian people because they're backing Putin on this. On the other hand, opinion is manipulated to such an extent and access to information is so controlled and restricted that I think we can excuse at least some of the Russian population for taking the view that they do concerning this present conflict. But beyond that, the day after, I mean, the day after, when eventually the war comes to an end, whether it seems to me unlikely through a negotiated settlement, because I think the goals of the two sides of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government are so far apart that I would be surprised if there were the war ends with a negotiated settlement, but maybe I'm wrong, or whether it ends with a kind of Korean-style ceasefire and informal truce, which becomes indefinite, possibly with the interposition of an international force. We don't know how this war will end yet. But however it ends, Russia will be there and the European Union will be there. And somehow or other, establishing some kind of stable, if not relationship, at least coexistence between the European Union and its member states on the one side and Russia on the other will be indispensable. We've been there before. We tried. We tried at the beginning of this century to find a way of engaging with Russia and building a stable relationship with Russia. When the EU launched its neighborhood policy around 2002, 2003, we said we'd be happy if Russia were to join this. In fact, after the collapse of communism, there was even some discussion, could Russia join NATO? We, for nearly 10 years, tried to negotiate with Russia a kind of strategic partnership. There were these negotiations around four spaces: economic, political, culture. I don't remember exactly how they were formulated now, which broadly speaking failed. Russia basically said thank you, but no thank you. We're not interested in the kind of relationship that others may have concluded with Europe, which are sort of Europe-centered. We want this to be a relationship of equals, the kind of relationship that Europe has with other strategic partners like the United States. And until now, we've always failed to negotiate such a relationship. But I agree entirely that when this war is over, by one means or another, it will be important to come to terms with Russia. And one can only hope that the war will end in conditions that make that possible.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Michael. And now, please, the two of us have been chatting now for quite a while. Happy to have any comment from you, question, please. Hi. I think, why don't you take one of...
We'll share.
Yeah. The young man who has the mic just left.
Hello. Hello. Okay, shall I just... I'll step away here. Hi, yeah.
Okay, he's here. Yes, please. Thank you.
Why don't you
Okay.
All right, sure. Hi, my name is Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network. My question's just on conflict resolution and sort of EU's diplomatic mediation kind of efforts. I mean, should we be laser focused on ending the Russian war right now and stopping the Russian threat in all its forms? Or can the EU be doing more sort of shuttle diplomacy, more initiatives? You know, for example, we've failed in Afghanistan, we've failed in Middle East now to stop this war. You know, perhaps even more initiatives to stabilize the relationship with China, because potentially we're drifting into more conflicts, and and I just wondered if there was more energy there for the EU to use.
Well, thanks for that question. I think that the EU now has a wonderful opportunity after the elections, new leaders coming in to think strategically about what we're aiming for after the war, and also vis-à-vis the other major powers in the world. You mentioned China. Len has talked extensively also about the United States. It is such an opportunity. I don't think the EU has the sort of forte for mediating in major conflicts involving major powers. I think we've got a reasonable track record in some areas, in the Western Balkans, for example, particularly the early part of this century, the circumstances under which the former Yugoslavia was dissolved and so on. The issues have not been solved, but to some extent they've been dealt with without recourse to violence now for nearly 2 decades, and the European Union played an important role in all of that. But I do think that by thinking more strategically about relations with China, with Russia, with the United States, with developing and emerging countries, we should be able to find a way that we can use our economic strength, our strength as a regulatory actor, and so on, to provide support for the main actors who will be involved in conflict resolution. And this will be more at the level of the United Nations and of individual sovereign states than of the European Union. So I don't see the European Union playing that kind of role, but I think it can provide really vital support by using the instruments that it does have, which are much more economic and regulatory instruments than what we used to call sort of high policy instruments, which still are very largely the preserve of the member states.
Michael, if I may, I mean, the current and soon-to-be former commission made quite a lot on the play of being a geopolitical commission and spoke a lot about geopolitical autonomy. So was that all just words?
Pause before answering.
Okay.
You know, I think European Commissions like to be characterized by something that people will remember.
Okay.
And the notion that this was in some sense a geopolitical commission was an attractive idea. I think it was an idea that was dreamt up in the back rooms pretty much at the last minute as a kind of slogan. And I think that what the European Union, the European Commission and the European Union have achieved over the last 5 years is very considerable. But it is not, broadly speaking, in Political Science 101, what we would generally call geopolitical. So I think that that label is to some extent misleading. But if we want these kind of broad conceptual slogans to characterize the Commission, I think the next European Commission should be more geo-economic rather than geopolitical.
Okay, please, gentlemen. We do have a mic.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you, Michael, in
see
Brussels.
you too.
I remember I was a young diplomat coming with the delegations to the European Commission, and it was always a pleasure, listening to your wise advice. On Russia, you mentioned that, what a huge cultural heritage Russian connection with Europe has. When it comes to the sanctions that have been taken against Russia, these all 13 packages, most of them didn't work. And there were some stupid decisions also, including cultural, isolation of Russia. Russian ballet teams were not allowed to come to the European theaters. Russian, big, even Bolshoi Theater or St. Petersburg, they were banned to come to Europe. Contracts with the artists have been cancelled, who were working in the European theaters with people with the great names. I believe that now, to try to turn back, it will be very, very difficult, because now Russia, and not only Russia, some other countries are now looking toward the east. China, India, there are lots of projects, northeast, east, south, and et cetera, et cetera. How Europe will restore all these connections, while within the Europe there is division. Unanimity becomes almost impossible. Now we see Hungary and other countries are looking to their own way. Now countries speak about even exiting NATO or European Union. China becomes soft power. Before it was only economically, but now we see China is pursuing very actively its soft power. We see it's also very active economically. Before it was only in Africa, now in Europe. In Hungary they are building the biggest electric cars battery factory, the same in Serbia, in some other countries. So that, do you think that you say about 2030 extension, but don't you think that there is a risk that European Union may fall apart?
Can I just say one little piece? The interesting thing, sir, thank you for this, was that there was even a big lobby to get the Nepalese government not to issue permits to Russian climbers of Everest for 2 years in a row. And there was a sense as well, where does it end? But to your point about the fact that the rest of the world has moved on, 15% of the world's people live in countries that enact or implement the sanctions against Russia. 85% of the world's people do not. And they are doing things. Right now, they are trading with each other using local currencies. They've built cross-border payment platforms to bypass SWIFT. They have taken fundamental central bank decisions with respect of reserve currencies. Asian group of 14 countries in Asia took the decision last year no longer to stockpile the euro, the yen, the pound sterling or the US dollar. And in fact, they build a new trade routes. They're working together. So the question is, just to add to the questions for Michael here, is not only what happens within the EU, because we can see schisms there, even from before, actually, but, one gets a sense that far from isolating Russia, what has happened is that there are realignments in place. And even though the economic might of the West is still very strong, the rest of the world is moving on because they don't want these wars. They want conditions of stability, economic stability for growth, right? So the wars are in the interest of only a minority of the world's people, even though they have paid a disproportionate price for these wars. The World Bank talks about a lost decade of development for countries of the South. So they're moving on, trying to repair those things. What happens then to the minority stake of the world held by the West? And one of the questions that I had for you coming towards the end, when I would say to you, Michael, your final thoughts. Well, I'll ask it to you now, so I'll ask you another final thought. In the EU bubble here in Brussels, sometimes there's not always that sense that, usually when the West went like this, the rest of the world stood up and took notice, but it's not happening anymore. Is there a sense today that the narrative And the approach to engagements and partnerships needs to be reviewed.
Well, there are so many interesting questions there, Len, and also a pleasure to see you again after so long, and all these issues about sanctions and about culture and where we're headed in relations with Russia and Russia's relations with the rest of the world. Come to Bologna and we'll have a seminar. Seriously, Len has visited Bologna once and we had a wonderful seminar with her, and we'll send you an invitation next time we have such a seminar. I could only really just touch on those issues very briefly at the end of our discussion. I think the reason why the European Union and other actors, but especially the European Union, uses sanctions to such a degree as an instrument of policy is its reluctance to move to the next stage, which would be direct military engagement. And sanctions are used as the instrument of choice because there is no consensus about becoming involved to a greater degree. Already, as I said earlier on, the European Peace Facility, the provision of armaments to Ukraine and so on, goes well beyond what the European Union has ever taken on in the past. So sanctions are a relatively convenient instrument which affect our own economic interests to some extent. They have not been without impact in Russia. It would be wrong to suggest they've had no impact, but they have not impeded Russia as far as the war is concerned, and they've not held back significantly economic growth within Russia. So to that extent, they have really not constrained Russia, which was the goal. So they could be said to be a failure in that regard. And again, you know, I think that if we want to be either a geopolitical or a geoeconomic actor, we have to think what are the instruments that are most effective. And sanctions have only a limited impact, especially if, as Len has pointed out, many countries around the world are not ready to follow suit. So on that particular issue, I think, you know, if I were the incoming high rep, which I'm very happy not to be, I would commission a study on this. I would get the think tanks to work together and to look and to consider the effectiveness of this instrument and what conclusions should be drawn, and what other instruments might be at our disposal in the future in some such situations. But as far as Russia is concerned, I think one can understand that at a period of war in which a candidate country of the European Union is experiencing casualties on a very large scale and so on. We could debate the origins of the war, the goals, the objectives of the two parties and so on. It is perhaps understandable that one should limit contacts in present circumstances to some degree. But at the same time, one has to be thinking about the day afterwards. And there, I think, I don't know what your next session is going to be here, but this could really merit very serious consideration, reflection, and discussion.
You'll have to come back.
Oh.
Anyone else, please? Whilst we wait for someone else, yeah, I was just going to just quickly just make the point that in the United States, Congress itself is commissioning studies on whether or not American policy with respect to the utility of sanctions really has the desired effect beyond hurting people in the country. And so you'll find, for example, that one of the historical sanctions in the United States is a sanction with respect of the embargo of Cuba. And this last September, of course, every country in the world voted in the affirmative that the embargo against Cuba was a historical wrong that needed to be righted, except the United States, except Israel, and Ukraine abstained. But every country said, you know, enough. Please. Yeah. And yeah.
I'll speak loudly.
Okay.
You didn't reply to the first question that was asked, and that is interesting. Will the EU fall apart? And will Hungary use all the BYD cars itself, being out of the market?
Well, I could just answer by no. The EU will not fall apart. With my students, we do a lot of scenario building, and, you know, collapse, disintegration, and so on is one of the scenarios. But I think the answer is clearly not. And yes, this investment in Hungary and Hungary's capability of producing electric vehicles certainly will make a big difference to the Hungarian economy. And of course, they have free access to the European market, so that will have an impact as well.
Yes, and then this lady.
Now the questions are all coming at the end.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrea Bellu of European Digital Rights. You mentioned previously EU's need to look more into doing a green and digital transition, right? And I'm wondering, how do you see EU's need to produce the technologies for these two transitions fitting with EU's need to produce the technologies for defense purposes as well? And I also have a question on scenario planning.
Okay.
In terms of Taiwan, what is the scenario look like there in regards to international solidarity, and where does that leave the EU in that scenario?
Well, let's leave that to the cocktail, shall we?
First or the second one?
The Taiwan, because I mean it is not on the agenda right now. Fortunately, it's a risk. And therefore, it's for scenario building. What would we do if? And you know, and I think it does merit serious consideration. We do have foresight units in the External Action Service, in the Commission, in think tanks, and I think that the policymakers should pay more attention to the implications of some of the work that is done on this. And but fortunately, for the time being, it's not on the immediate agenda.
It's mainly viewed as an American issue, right?
Or as an issue, it's seen as a European issue too, I think, from the point of view of principle. But I mean, the EU is not an actor as such in the Indo-Pacific in security and defense terms. I mean, the French and the British, they have their aircraft carriers, not always with sufficient number of planes in the UK's case, and they patrol around Taiwan just to show support and so on. But for the time being, I mean, certainly not the EU, and even member states are very secondary actors in this. So it's a very important question. But the first part of your question,
Digital transition.
The digital transition, investment, and where we stand in terms of innovation. I do think that there is a challenge for the European Union in that it aspires to being a global regulator. I mean, these books of Anu Bradford, the Brussels Effect, and digital empires. I mean, who will regulate digital matters in the future? Will it be the Chinese approach, the American approach, the European approach, some combination of these? Will they compete as regulatory frameworks and so on? But I think it's pretty obvious that with the EU, with Europe, not being on the cutting edge of innovation or commercial development, for example, of artificial intelligence, and having an approach, we're very proud of the fact, you know, the first AI Act in the world. By the way, acts don't appear in the Treaty of Rome or in the other treaties. The EU doesn't have acts, but it sounds good. Okay, the first AI Act in the world, which is people-centered and which is mainly concerned with protecting rights to privacy and so on against the challenge from AI. But the idea that we, with our preoccupations, not being a major actor in innovation and commercial development, will influence others and that they will take on board our standards. If it suits them, they will. And the Chinese even took some aspects of the GDPR for their own purposes and were ready to be inspired by some aspects of European regulation. That may happen again in AI. But we can't expect to be the dominant regulator in these fields. I quite agree.
Thank you, Michael. Sir. We'll go on for another 5 minutes and then have some drinks.
Thank you for all the answers that you gave, and thank you for the moderations. I am Maurice Mateke, Public Affairs Consultant at Meridia Partners. So I wanted to make a comment. Instead of sanctions, I think European countries or Western countries should commit themselves on international law, because we see what is happening now with Israel. Many countries from Europe are supporting Israel, but we know that African countries are facing some threat. Leaders, not countries, but leaders are facing some threat to be moved to international court because of human rights abuses and so on. So I think that European countries should gain their credibility if they start to commit themselves on international law instead of imposing sanctions on some countries. Thank you.
Well, I can only agree that, I mean, international law should be the foundation for our action and the action for all international actors. The problem is that when countries or organizations see interests involved, they don't always act on the basis of the principles of international law. One would wish that they would. I mean, you mentioned the situation with Israel-Gaza. One might also take into consideration the current situation in Sudan, for example, where also international law is being violated on a massive scale, and where there's a real risk of genocide. And we don't see actors around the world responding to this particular conflict, mainly in terms of the principles of international law. You know, some people sometimes say no one gets sent to prison for breaking an international law. I mean, international law ought to be the foundation for the action of any power in the international system. I quite agree. And I think it is to a considerable extent, but not always. And we should press for international law to have a greater influence, but we have to accept that countries first and foremost act on the basis of their perception of their interests. And if international law is in line with that, all well and good, and if it's not, they tend to act anyway in the way that they consider will be most conducive to their country's influence. But there is inconsistency and there are contradictions on the part of the European Union, but also on the part of many other international actors.
Yeah, it's really very interesting that on this matter of the International Criminal Court and the issue of South Africa's application to the ICJ, that Spain announced last night that it will also enjoin itself to that application, as has all of the countries of the Global South and many others as well. So it's this issue as well of inconsistency, but also interest. Spain has fairly declared what its interest is with respect of upholding international law from the perspective of a sovereign state, and other countries in Europe have that same sort of sensibility and the right to make that decision as well. But please, you had
a question about UK actually, so
yeah.
it might be nice.
Yeah. And then we break.
Continue.
Please.
Okay, great. Great. Anyway, sorry. So the UK is possibly about to make a new change in its journey. So could tell us something about what you feel the lessons learned are from the British experience, and what will you expect from the UK as a non-EU member, but coming back to the table, what do you hope that the UK will now contribute to the European project?
Well, this has to be guesswork because the Labour Party and the Labour leader have been rather quiet about this during the election campaign and before, probably making the correct calculation that they don't need to take very clear positions on issues such as this ahead of the elections. But the strong feeling is, given where they're coming from, that if there is a new government, a Labour government, or even, who knows? I mean, everyone's very confident now that there'll be a very large Labour majority. Maybe there will, maybe there won't. Maybe it'll be a smaller majority, or maybe they'll have, again, to form a coalition. Who knows? I mean, things don't always work out the way the polls imply, as we learned in 2016 in the United States and elsewhere. But assuming that there is a government in the UK with a working majority and which sees a national interest in closer relations with the European Union in various fields, I would expect this to begin in the areas of security and defense, science, research, innovation, and education. Security and defense because of the crises that we are facing, and because the United Kingdom is a very important medium-sized international actor in the area of security and defense, and that there's an interest for both sides in coordinating closely in this area. And the area of innovation, science, research, education was already carved out in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as an area where even the Conservative government was ready to foresee further cooperation. And I think this will go even further. I mean, until now, the Labour Party has ruled out not only returning to the customs union or the single market, but even developing closer links with it. One can imagine that there are various regulatory fields where the Conservatives have, as a matter of principle, advocated regulatory divergence. One wouldn't think that a future Labour government would advocate divergence for its own sake, and that would rather explore areas where there would be a mutual interest in cooperation. Now, whether then the EU would respond positively or would come back to the old slogan of no cherry picking remains to be seen. But I think there will be greater openness in any event to closer cooperation in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Michael. Thank you so very much, all of you and everyone who has joined us virtually. It has been a good session. Thank you so very much, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.